Hello everyone, welcome back to Blockman editor tutorial. In these videos, we will give you a complete introduction to the Blockman editor. In this video, we will introduce the contents related to the item triggers. Go to the editor and click on item in the game components view. Let's create an item first. Then click on the trigger edit to enter the trigger edit interface of the item. Here we can edit the triggers for the item. There are several nodes that you need to pay attention to when using the trigger nodes of an item. About the when the item is used and when the item is consumed nodes. The when the item is used node is triggered when the entity long presses an item to use, and is often used to achieve effects such as the entity eating food items, or using medication items. The when the item is consumed node is triggered when an entity uses skills to consume items. For example, when we use firearms to shoot, the shooting skill will consume bullet items, and the scenario of bullets being consumed corresponds to the when the item is consumed node. So when you choose to use these two trigger nodes to design the game logic, you need to pay attention to the corresponding usage scenarios. About the when the item is held in hand node, and the when the item's handheld status is cancelled node. The when the item is held in hand node is triggered when the entity is holding the item. It's commonly used to achieve the effect of allowing the entity to gain buffs or skills while holding the item. When the item's handheld status is cancelled node is triggered when the entity puts the item away, and is mostly used to remove the buff or skill obtained when the item is being handheld. These two nodes can be used in conjunction with each other. For example, we can have an entity add a buff when holding the item, and then remove the buff when the entity removes the item. Regarding the when an item trap is triggered node, this node will be triggered only after the trap property is checked for the item. This node is often used to achieve the effect of damaging or killing an entity when a trap is triggered. Next, let's create two example scenarios for the item triggers. Item A aims to achieve the effect, the entity floats when it holds the item. When the entity is not holding the item, it cancels the floating state and drop down. Item B aims to achieve the effect, when the entity picks up the item, but will trigger the slowdown effect due to freezing and losing HP. First, let's design the trigger logic for the item A. Click on item A to open the trigger edit interface in the properties view. Click the new button to add a when the item is held in hand trigger node. Then double-click on the execution port to open the list of action nodes, and select the action node add buff to the entity and entity. Double-click on the execution port behind the entity parameter, and select the entity that holds an item in hand node in the current trigger parameters in the list of action nodes. Select the prepared floating buff for the buff parameter, and uncheck the limit duration of the buff parameter. This completes the logic of holding the item A to make the entity float. Then we have to create the logic for removing the floating buff after cancelling the handheld status. Click the Add Trigger button in the top left corner to add a when the item's handheld status is cancelled trigger node. Double-click the execution port, and select the action node, remove buff by types from entity in the action node list. Double-click the execution port behind the entity parameter, and select the entity that cancel the item's handheld status node in the current trigger parameters in the list of action nodes. For the buff parameter setting, select the floating buff, so that when we cancel the handheld, the buff is removed from the entity. Next, let's make the trigger logic for the item B. Click on item B to open the trigger edit interface in the properties view. Click the new button to add the when the item is picked up trigger node. Then double-click on the execution port to open the list of action nodes, and select the action node add buff to the entity and entity. Double-click on the execution port behind the entity parameter, and select the entity that picks up the item node from the current trigger parameters in the list of action nodes. For the buff parameter setting, select the freeze buff we prepared, and the buff duration parameter is set to 5 seconds. Then click the Add Trigger button in the trigger node to add a new action node. Double-click on the execution port, and select the Start Timer node in the logic action list to add a timer. The interval parameter is set to 1 second, and the times parameter is set to 5 times. Then double-click the execution port in the Start Timer node, and select the Damage Entity node in the Entity Action list. Set the entity parameter to connect to the entity that picks up the item node, in the current trigger parameters, and set the damage parameter to 1. So that when the entity picks up the item, it will slow down due to freezing, and the logic of losing HP is also complete. Now let's place the items in the scene, and then run the game to see the results. As you can see, when the entity is holding the item A, the entity starts to float upwards. When the entity cancels holding item A, it stops floating and fall down. When the entity picks up the item B, it triggers the slowdown effect due to freezing and losing HP. That's all for this video. We hope it can help you on your way to a great creator. If you want to know more about the editor, you can comment below the video or post on the official forum. See you in the next video.